Hello, I'm Chris Mularczyk, welcoming you to another edition of World Today, the program that looks at the global reactions to the war in Ukraine. The Putin regime is now the #1 enemy for America and NATO, and unlike the Soviet Union of old, it's not an enemy that has not had plentiful contact with the West over the past 30 years. Here with me in the studio to discuss how Russia came to exercise influence that helped to put the West to sleep, we have historian Professor David Engels.
Good evening.
Good evening. And by video link, we have historian and libertarian Alejandro Chafuen, who's speaking to us from the Acton Institute in Virginia. Welcome. Welcome to World Today.
Good evening.
Gentlemen, first of all, I'm going to play you a clip from Joe Biden, who is visiting Poland today. Obviously, this is a big event today in Poland, so I just want to start the program off with that before we move on to other things. Let's hear from Mr. Biden.
The single most important thing that we can do from the outset is keep the democracies united in our opposition and our effort to curtail the devastation that is occurring at the hands of a man who, I quite frankly, think is a war criminal. And I think it will meet the legal definition of that as well.
War criminal, David, is that your take on Putin? And is that the tough line and tough language that should be used against Russia today?
Yeah, that's a big question. Of course, Biden knows that rhetoric is obviously much more easy for the moment than concrete actions. He knows that NATO is deeply divided, that already more than 50% of many people in NATO states are not even willing to defend NATO allies, so certainly not any more states that are outside of NATO. And so he has to limit himself on rhetoric. And after the disaster of Afghanistan, of course, there is a certain fear of being engaged in yet another war, and that explains why we are limiting ourselves to economic sanctions, but certainly not in any military actions, obviously.
Alejandro, do you agree with that pessimistic assessment that actually this is all simply rhetoric and basically NATO is still behind the curve here?
I agree that it is behind the curves, but I don't. I think it's important to have unity against what I believe has been an aggression and an overreaction by Putin. I find no justification for him to invade and attack Ukraine in the way that he's doing now. So I agree that I would regard him as a war criminal. And again, uniting all democracies defined as people define democracy today, that is almost majority vote. It's not something that I'm fond of, because there are many countries like India or Brazil, which have been playing, sometimes like a double role in this situation. But again, I think it's very dangerous what will happen to the world if Putin is able to take over Ukraine.
Now, I want to move on now and talk about how Russia has been influencing events in the past. And of course, in history, Russia has a very long history of using agents elsewhere to get its way. Then, of course, we had the Soviet period where it had major propaganda campaigns such as the pacifist campaigns. Now, do you think that this, in a way, this is something that Putin is repeating, except that, of course, he's not using any pacifist language, but he is actually he has abandoned communism and moved on to other things such as nationalism in order to actually diversify, to have more fingers in more pies, and has been pretty effective as a result. David Engels.
Yeah, absolutely. There are certainly there's a big investment on the part of Putin in things like Russia Today, also in paying off, of course, people, influencers in the West, giving them important jobs or also money. But I think it's not necessarily about sympathy with Russia and Putin, but rather the fruit of antipathy for the United States, for the Western world, for a certain form also of leftist liberalism that pushes many conservatives also in the hand of Russia. And I'm quite sure, perhaps that's a provocative thesis, but I don't think that the sympathy for Russia would be so big if, for example, Donald Trump were still president of the United States. I'm quite sure that many conservatives in Europe would be much less inclined to be in sympathy with Russia. They now associate, of course, Putin as the enemy of the West, and they see, of course, behind Ukraine, they see the involvement of the United States, they associate the United States with Joe Biden, with a certain wokist ideology. And so this becomes, for many conservatives, a war of system, where the hate of the US push them into the arms of Putin, as well on the left as on the right side. On the right side, we have this mistaken belief that Vladimir Putin somehow stands for conservative values, which he clearly isn't, or not as we as Westerners believe it. Right. But also on the left side, of course, Russia becomes the epitome of the weak nation that is attacked by this evil imperialist, colonialist system that is pushed by Western capitalism and that kind of thing. So we have this very curious alliance of extreme left and extreme right against Russia, but for Russia against the US, not out of sympathy necessarily for Putin, but rather out of antipathy for what the West is becoming.
Alejandro, do you agree with that analysis?
Yes, I have to agree, and also want to congratulate David Engels. I was able to read his work, and I think is very deep thinking about the future of Europe that I find in his work. Let us not forget that a large majority in a poll done by Harvard, more than 2/3 of the people believe that Putin would not have attacked Ukraine and have done this if Trump would have been president. You know, he has this quality of being unpredictable, like Ronald Reagan. So I don't think this will be happening.
Well,
but I have to agree.
This is interesting because a lot of people in Europe believe something completely different. They argue that actually Trump, with his skepticism about NATO, the positive things that he said about Vladimir Putin being a strong leader, that actually Trump was ambiguous on Russia. So why do you feel that Trump actually would have been able to stop Vladimir Putin doing something like Ukraine? Why do either of you think that? Alejandro, let's start with you.
Well, President Trump did not see the world as like a scholar. He was in a way from another planet. See how he treated each of these leaders, you know, from the leader of Korea to Xi Jinping. He almost see it, or even Erdogan. He almost sees it, you know, he's very, sorry for what I'm going to say, but he's fond of this fake World Wrestling Federation that all about image. Right. He had a big career. You know, here comes the small dwarf with the big chest. Here comes, you know, the Chinese giant, and Erdogan, you know, from the Ottoman Empire. And but so he could be frightening in some ways. But on the other hand, he was frightening also not only to friends, but mostly to enemies. So I'm convinced.
Right. So it's the unpredictability.
This might be happening if Putin would be if Trump would be in power.
David, do you agree with that? Do you agree that the unpredictability might have made Putin think, well, I might not be a good idea?
That is certainly an aspect. I would also agree with that. But my point was rather that if this war had happened under Trump presidency, I think that many European conservatives would have seated not with such an enthusiasm on the Russian side. Right. I think they would have seen this as a conflict between two conservatives, and perhaps rather than have supported the US than Russia.
Now, what's going on that people on the American right people like Tucker Carlson, I think Bannon as well, seem to be very ambivalent or even pro-Russian on this whole thing. What's going on, David?
I think that the more leftist liberal system of the Western world that is led, of course, by the United States has led itself ad absurdum during these last years. I think that the transition from Trump to Biden has been seen as a big shock, not only in US milieux, but also in the West. I think that this witch hunt after the alleged storm on the Capitol and so forth has really, and the Black Lives Matters manifestations and things like that have really traumatized people on the conservative side, and they see somehow now, also after the measures linked to COVID, of course, they now seem to think that we are on the brink of really entering some form of world government, of great reset, and that somehow Russia is perhaps the last possibility to avoid it. I think that's how they see probably reality.
So maybe it's even almost close to the enemy of my enemy being my friend. Is it, you think, Alejandro, that's a fair assessment?
Yeah, sorry, that's perfect the way you summarize it. Seems that people are making a big mistake, just because you like some aspects, of President Trump or some of the opposition of President Putin to some of the cultural agenda, then people buy other aspects of their agenda. Almost that people have not been able to discriminate and judge each policy by its own merit. So, or you're 100% with Trump, or you hate Trump completely. And the same with other leaders. And I think it's very damaging, and it's. I was surprised I heard Tucker Carlson yesterday, and I think he went, a little bit beyond prudence, in the attitude that we have to this war and this invasion.
David, turning now to more towards Europe and European conservatives, do you think the picture is similar here in that the sympathy with Putin was in that he was opposed to, or at least he said he was opposed to a cultural leftist agenda, but it's also the fact that he was a counterweight to the European Union. And that was also, for conservative circles, important. Do you think anything here will change now that Putin has done what he's done? Do you think that it's possible now that people will realize that actually this man is a huge danger to our security, to our way of life, to our freedom, and so forth, and that actually European conservatives will turn against him or not?
Yeah, big question. I see there's a mounting hysteria on the side of conservative Putin supporters. There is some nervosity that indeed Putin obviously has gone very far, much farther than many people on the right would have thought it possible, that it becomes more and more difficult to support, to be still in favor of Russia. Nevertheless, many people have also burned their ships behind them, their bridges. They're already on the side of Russia. And so there will be certainly a big rift within the European conservatives, but the outcome will depend on the outcome of the war. If we will be soon in the middle of a Cold War in case Putin wins somehow, or if the Russian Federation implodes in case of a defeat, that will change, of course, fundamentally also the position of the European conservatives.
Alejandro, maybe also what may change for the European conservatives, and to some extent American conservatives too, is the return of economic issues such as inflation, money supply, and so forth. And maybe that will bring conservatives back towards more traditional perspectives. Do you think that's possible?
I hope so. And again, I agree with what David said before. There will be many unintended consequences, as the result of this war, big shifts in populations, new friendships and new enmities, among nations. Regarding around President Trump, one of my closest friends, I don't know how he's seen in Poland, Sebastian Gorka, who I met many years, work against terrorism. He was like a deputy to Trump in the White House. He has not minced words against Vladimir Putin, and saying, conservatives cannot endorse these acts of war that he has where he has embarked on. But again, I think, because I value Western civilization and the values, of family, of freedom of religion,
Right.
of private property, respect for the culture of each nation. But
Okay.
I think a weak economic system and printing money, expanding government spending, in the end, it can work against the true agenda, the valuable agenda that Western leaders should be pushing for the free society.
Okay.
So I hope
Okay.
people get more serious with economics, but I do not know
Okay,
if that
we'll
would
see.
happen.
I want to turn now to how that influence that Russia has been exercising has actually come to be exercised. And I want to play a little piece, first of all, from a very old piece, actually from the 1980s, a video from an interview that was done by a former KGB officer named Bezmerov.
Only about 15% of time, money, and manpower is spent on espionage as such. The other 85% is a slow process, which we call either ideological subversion or active measures, активные мероприятия in the language of the KGB, or psychological warfare. What it basically means is to change the perception of reality of every American to such an extent that despite of the abundance of information, no one is able to come to sensible conclusions in the interests of defending themselves, their families, their community, and their country.
Now, in the same interview, he identifies 4 phases, the first being the longest, and that being demoralization of a nation or a set of nations, and then moving that on to crisis, first destabilization, then crisis, and then finally normalization in the sense of an autocratic regime or a communist regime. Now, okay, that was for the Soviet Union. But does it still ring true that that is the kind of process that Russia likes to follow, that it likes to actually demoralize the enemy, and that it uses all kinds of weapons to do that? Funding of various bodies and various individuals, maybe also obviously the media that it has at its disposal and the influence that it may have in other media. What do you think, David? Is this a fair description of what Russia's up to?
I think that these are still some of the major measures of every secret service, and that is of course also applied now. That is quite sure. Nevertheless, I think that one of the main problems is that the West, or at least the leftist liberal West, has dug its own hole also, because for years and for years the media or the mainstream media have become so obviously politically dominated also by a certain mindset that people simply have lost trust. Not everyone, but many people. And so they are, of course, much more open for any form of fake news and disinformation than before. They have lost trust in their main media, and so they are so accustomed of being served also lies and obviously blatantly ideologically dominated information, that they are now open for everything. And that is something that Russia really knows how to exploit. And of course, the other measures are also true. I mean, except mainly in Germany, we have this very strongly rhetoric about about Ukraine is losing the war, and so they have to capitulate immediately in order to save lives. So obviously there's this pacifist, somewhat cowardly rhetoric that Russia is also feeding into Germany, and that is working, of course, very strongly, because in Germany the soil is also ready, because they want to show now that the contrast to the Second World War, now they are keen on saving lives and not fighting unto the last drop of blood. And so that works, of course, quite well, this pacifism for this demilitarized nation.
Yeah, Alejandro, do you agree here with David that Russia, even during this war, is able to get its messaging across, to sow seeds of discord as well? Do you think that it is managing to do that, or is the Ukrainian offensive by Zelensky and so on actually strong enough to resist it? What do you think?
Well, but I agree with David that in a way the West is doing it to itself. We have seen, the obscene way of the blackout of the corruption of the Biden family, with Hunter Biden collecting,
Right. Yeah.
board seats, very incredibly well paid, and passing a percentage to the family. That's now is being acknowledged that all that information was true, and we have now almost 2 years of the blackout. Now in the United States, you will not believe it, despite that gas prices and inflation rose tremendously before the war, almost in unison, all the media except one or two channels, they are calling the Biden gas hike, the Putin gas
Not
hike,
Putin gas
the
hike.
Putin inflation. And everyone plays the game. So obviously, the regular viewer, then you have the Putin's propaganda saying, "Oh, Hunter is behind the biological labs." So it makes very difficult for common people to know what is truth. That interview is fascinating, by the former KGB agent, because he also explained how they worked within the church to weaken the church, against private property, with the whole effort of liberation theology. So they are this being almost dictatorship and very authoritarian country, they can do better this propaganda than a more democratic country.
David, do you also find that, obviously, trying to counter the woke agenda, genderism, cancel culture, atheism, in that way, Putin was trying to make himself sympathetic to Western conservative circles. But of course, he was also doing other things on separatism in Europe, isolationism in the United States, where, of course, that is a strand in both the Democratic and Republican parties, or even things like opposition to nuclear power, which was helping to get gas sales into Germany. Is a very serious issue there. So do you think that those were also very, very important in the propaganda campaign that was launched, which did weaken the West?
Yeah, of course. All these are parts of a large scheme, and even if Russia didn't necessarily invent all that, but it played certainly out strongly in favor of Russia and in favor, of course, of a dislocation of Western solidarity. Of course, also COVID has to be added to that, because it was so obvious how Russia today, on the one hand, in France, for example, really became an advocate of anti-vaccine, anti-COVID lockdown measures, and tried really to discredit the government by insisting on the unlawfulness of all these measures, whereas at the same time in Russia it did exactly the same thing it criticized in other countries. But of course people didn't know that, and people just received, well, we have to look at Russia today in order to get some real information we are deprived of by our national channels, and all in the end, of course, all that worked out and made this and created this impression of Russia as being the last channel of some force or champion of some force of truth, of conservatism. And we have to say, unfortunately, that is also one of the, occasions that were missed also by countries like Poland, for example, who could also have tried to show how there can be a conservatism within the European Union, within a democratic framework, within Western tradition, and then people don't need to turn to Russia and to believe in many of these lies, but that there is already one representative of true conservatism right next door.
Alejandro, do you agree with that? In that, in a way, the conservative movement became corrupted here?
Well, it's complicated. I do not know enough about the conservative movement in Europe in order to make that judgment, like a blanket statement of the conservatives. I think like in the United States, there are many varieties of conservatives, so, but again, the fact that Putin became champion of some causes that many people like. Even I in favor. I'm a pro-life. I believe marriages between one man and one woman. But again, I don't think if you will find any word ever that I said in favor of Putin during my entire life.
Yeah, I understand perfectly. My last final question to you both is, what do you think the Russians are now going to be doing on the propaganda front, apart from sowing discord? What kind of issue may they pick for the future, if, of course, they survive this war in one piece? Could it be the peace movements again? You mentioned demilitarization, you mentioned the humanitarian bent in Germany and in other countries. Might Russia return to that theme, which it used very well in the 70s and 80s? David?
Yeah, that might certainly be a possibility. And also, of course, it will sell the Eurasian bloc that is slowly forming as some form of alternative to the Western world and showing, well, we have already achieved peace, harmony between all different countries. This is true multiculturalism as Russia and China and Iran and perhaps India live together in the respect of their respective zones of influence. And so that might also have a big influence, of course, on many people in the West and be linked to a pacifist movement, as if the West is the only one who is just opposed to some form of harmony within Eurasia.
Indeed, so Putin still has cards to play, and of course he has caused already causing a food crisis, a fuel crisis, a migration crisis, a security crisis. So it's not as if he is totally on the back foot, is it, Alejandro? He's still very much in the game. Would you agree?
Correct. Again, it's an enormous country, with enormous natural resources. I think we're going to be seeing a push for more energy independence and more autarky in issues, in all goods that have relevance for national security. I wouldn't be surprised if some new countries will again also move forward in having nuclear arms. So a lot of this will depend on the end result of this invasion.
Indeed, of course, this war will be decisive. It's already a decisive moment in history. The 24th of February 2022 may go down in a similar way as 9/11. Alejandro Chafuen, thank you very much for joining us here on World Today. Professor David Engels, thank you very much for being with us. Next up, we have Military Mind. Stay with us here on TVP World. We'll be back shortly after a break.